Hey everybody, I recently reached the end of a 28-year journey that took me through the entire Stephen King bibliography. Every standalone book, by my count there are 77 of them, from 1974 to today. I recently finished the very last one that I had to read. So this is going to be a slightly different kind of video. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I have a tendency to talk and talk and talk and talk. Well, if I'm gonna do a video where I show 77 different titles in one video and I don't want it to be 3 hours long, I'm gonna have to try to keep it brief. So without further ado, in chronological order based on when I read them, here is my personal journey through the Stephen King library. The journey began in 1995 when I was 12 years old and I read Carrie for the first time and then promptly read it again and again. And of all Stephen King's books, Carrie is the one that I have read the most times over the years. 1995, I was 12, Carrie, book number 1. In 1996, I was 13, and I moved on from Carrie to some collections because the idea of short stories really appealed to me. So I read Night Shift and Skeleton Crew, books 2 and 3. Book 4 was another novel that also came in 1996 when I was 13 years old. And I read The Shining for the first time, and it scared the hell out of me when I was a kid. And I recently reread it, and it scared the hell out of me again as an adult, but for different reasons. But here's book 4, The Shining. In 1997, I was 14, and I read The Green Mile for the first time. This was pretty brand new, and it was the first new Stephen King book that I read. And I'm not normally a fast reader, and I made my way sort of in fits and starts through the first part of the book. And then one day, for the first time in my life, I sat just enraptured for hours, literally spent like 6 hours and barely got up off the couch, just reading The Green Mile almost from start to finish in one sitting. It's still one of my very favorites of all time. Books 6, 7, and 8 came in 1998, which was the year I turned 15. In 1998, I read Christine, which I loved, and on a reread, couldn't stand in the last few years. Cujo, which I loved, and in a reread in the last few years, scared me to death and made me feel sick. So I can't say that I loved it. I respected it the second time around, but it's still one hell of a scary book. And book number 8 in 1998 was another fairly recent one, Desperation. And it was the first really big Stephen King book that I ever read. And I remember just falling into that world and going along for the ride and just being thrilled and having the time of my life. It's been like 25 years since I read this one for the first time, and it'll be next up on my to reread pile. 1999 was the year I turned 16, and I read 3 more books that year, starting with Gerald's Game, masterpiece, definitely one of Stephen King's most underrated novels in my opinion. I loved it then, and I can't wait to reread it again sometime soon. After that, I read another fairly recent one, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. It's obviously a very slim novel, could probably be considered a novella, but while it was different than anything I had read by him before, I still enjoyed it. It's not one of my favorites, but I think that it is just fine. And the final book I read in 1999 was my second really big Stephen King book, and that is Insomnia. And even though the main character is a 70-year-old man, I thoroughly enjoyed it and found it engrossing even as a 16-year-old. And I'm currently going through it again, and I find it just as enjoyable and entertaining as engrossing now as I did when I was a teenager. The year 2000 apparently wasn't a big reading year for me, because I only read one book, and it's one of Stephen King's smallest and quickest to read, Cycle of the Werewolf. So that was it for 2000. 2001 didn't fare much better. I was just starting college. I was a freshman in college in my first semester, and I dove into the Dark Tower series by reading the revised and expanded The Gunslinger, and made it through, and promptly, the next year, 2002, dove into The Drawing of the Three, which is by far my favorite, most enjoyable Dark Tower novel, and still one of my favorite books of all time. So 2002 saw me read 3 Stephen King books, starting with Drawing of the Three, moving on to a couple of more recent ones for the time. Everything's Eventual, the story collection, which has some great stuff. I don't remember much of the specifics of this one, but 2002. And then finally, From a Buick 8, which I remember has a couple of really, really exciting set pieces, but didn't make a huge impression on me. It's not one of my top tier Stephen King. Although, like everything else that's not top tier Stephen King, it is fine. It was a good book. It just didn't make a big impression on me. So that is 2002. So moving on to 2003, that's the year I turned 20, and I read 2 books in 2003. I continued my journey to the Dark Tower in the Wastelands, and I also took months to read the complete and uncut version of The Stand, which blew my mind and for years and years remained my #1 very favorite book of all time. It is not that anymore, but I still have fond memories of reading it for the first time in college. In 2004, I continued my journey to the Dark Tower. And personal note, I had my first serious relationship when I was in my late teens, and I had been broken up with, and I was devastated. As you are, the first cut is the deepest and all of that. And to help get me through my funk and my depression, I passed the time by reading Wizard and Glass. And this book is so beautifully written. It's so cathartic. It was so exactly what I needed at that moment in my life. It holds a very special place. Drawing of the Three is my favorite and most entertaining Dark Tower novel. Wizard and Glass is the best, and one of the best things that Stephen King has ever written. And I moved on in 2004 and continued my journey with Wolves of the Calla. Interesting factoid, 2004, this book was relatively new, and I bought it new, and I read this exact same copy, which makes it extra special to me. I don't have many things in my collection now that I had, when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, but the books 5, 6, and 7 of the Dark Tower series, those are my original copies. So 2005 was another 3-book year, and it began in the early months of 2005 with Salem's Lot. Still one of my very favorite Stephen King books of all time. One of most people's very favorite Stephen King books of all time, and for good reason. It was cold outside, I remember that, and I just fell into the world of this book, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And fun factoid, personal factoid, this copy, this mass market paperback, this is the very book that I read in 2005, and it was used when I bought it, and it's more used now. And I've gone back to Salem's Lot a few times in the years since, and when I do, I always read this copy. It's sort of like my good luck charm. But after Salem's Lot, I continued my journey to the Dark Tower with Song of Susannah, which I don't remember much about, except this is the book where they meet Stephen King, which I thought was really fun and really cool. I know it kind of turned people off, but I thought that was a really neat plot development. I don't remember much else about it, though. And then I finished 2005 with another new to that year book, The Colorado Kid, which I think is kind of a stinker. I don't have good feelings or memories of this one. I remember that it's a mystery in search of a solution. that doesn't come. And there's even an afterword to the book where Stephen King gets kind of defensive about not solving the mystery. And I just kind of felt like it was a waste of my time. It's one of my least favorite Stephen King books of all time. But that's 2005. 2006 was a year I only read one book, but it took me a long time to read it, and it was an amazing experience. And that was when I finished my Journey to the Dark Tower, and I read book 7 in the series. I remember very, very vividly getting to the end, almost breathlessly. I just couldn't put it down. It was a page turner. And then the ending made me go, huh? Oh my God! I was so pissed. But over the years, I've come to realize that it was the best, most perfect, and like only ending that the novel could have had. And it's an amazing accomplishment that this huge thing, and he went there. And even though this book feels to me kind of rushed at the end, like he was running out of steam and just trying to get it finished, it is still a masterpiece and a magnum opus when taken as an entire series. But anyway, that was it. This one book was it for 2006. 2007 was another slow reading year for me, apparently, or I was reading other things that year, but it was the year that I read Blaze for the first time, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I do look forward to reading again at some point. Being as big of a Stephen King nerd as I am now, I think the origin of this being a trunk novel that King pulled out and revised and gave it publication, I think is fascinating. And it's most people, it's not like on their top 10 list, and it's not on mine either, but it's a fine little book. And 2008, the year I turned 25, it's another, I don't know what I was doing that whole year, but I managed to read one book, one Stephen King book anyway. I think I probably read other stuff, but that year was the year I read Just After Sunset. And this is a fine collection of stories. I don't remember the titles off the top of my head, but I'm sure if I looked at the table of contents, it would come back to me. I remember thoroughly enjoying Just After Sunset. 2009, I didn't read a single Stephen King book. I don't know what the heck was wrong with me. No Stephen King books in 2009. 2010, I read one collection, and that was Full Dark, No Stars. And I think that this is another one of Stephen King's most underrated books. The 4 stories in this, I think, are brilliant, and I absolutely love them. There are supernatural elements, but it downplays that in a very interesting and visceral way, which I really appreciated. I can't wait to read these stories again. Good stuff. 2011, I didn't read a Stephen King book. 2012, I didn't read a Stephen King book. I gotta find some more books on my shelf. I'll be right back. So it brings us to 2013, the year I turned 30, and I'm 39 now, so get ready. Things are about to kick into high gear. But in 2013, when it first came out, I read Joyland, which I think is another great, underappreciated Stephen King. It's a small novel, it's a modest novel, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. 2014, Revival, definitely a dark Stephen King masterpiece. I'm a big fan of this one, and for some reason, I feel like it's underappreciated, but I think that it's brilliant, and someday I will read it again. I have not done that so far. 2015, The Bazaar of Bad Dreams. I'm always a fan of a Stephen King collection, and novellas, short stories, what have you, and Bazaar of Bad Dreams is another just really good collection. 2016, Bag of Bones, or because it contains more of a sexual element than any Stephen King book I had read up to that point, I took to thinking of it as Bag of Boners when I was reading it. But it's another dairy story, which I really appreciate now, although I hadn't read it yet, I did enjoy going to Derry, and I enjoyed the more mature tone and the romance and the sexual mystery elements and the ghost story elements. This is one heck of a good book. I'm a big fan. 2017, a little bit of a diversion. Gwendy's Button Box, Stephen King, written in conjunction with Richard Chismar. Another slim little volume, a novella, and it's quirky and it's modest, and I enjoyed it. I thought that it was pretty good. And then in 2017, I read one of Stephen King's all-time masterpieces because a movie was coming out and I wanted to have read the book before I saw the movie. I'm so ashamed and I'm so embarrassed. But regardless, I still read it and I loved it. So in 2017, I read it for the first time. This very paperback, in fact. And if you want an indication of how anal I am when I'm reading paperbacks, here's a look at the spine. Completely unbroken spine. This book is 1,100 pages long. I held it daintily open like this, and it's still unbroken spine. That's how anal I am about reading my Stephen King paperbacks. We're now up to 2018. And 2018 was the year that I made a concerted effort to go back and read the older stuff that I had missed. So with that in mind, my first book of 2018 was The Dead Zone. One of my favorites, absolute masterpiece. I feel like The Dead Zone is a bit underrated, and I think that it may be just because it's Stephen King's first person-based, personal. I know that doesn't make sense, but it's based on an individual. It's a little bit more low-key. It's a little bit less flashy and apocalypse-y and end-of-the-worldy and haunted hotel-y. So, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. That was my first book of 2018. Moving on from there, I read Mr. Mercedes, another masterpiece. I'm a huge fan of the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, and this book is scary and brilliant, and the climactic scene at a concert, very reminiscent of Insomnia in some ways, but it still stands alone as a brilliant set piece, and I'm a big fan. And the final book that I read in 2018 was Stephen King's collaboration with his son Owen, Sleeping Beauties. And this was one that I really, really enjoyed, and I did it on audiobook, and I think that might have made all the difference. The narrator was excellent, and I understand that this book is quite divisive. There's a lot of people that just hate the paper that this is printed on. They can't stand Sleeping Beauties. I really liked it. I thought it was a cool idea and well executed. And if you hated it and you were trying to read the book, and give the audiobook a try next time, you may be surprised. So that brings us to 2018. So what is that? 23 years. In the 23 years between 1995 and 2018, I read 36 books. And in the 29, 19, 20, 21, 22, in the 4 years and change between 2019 and 2023, I did 41. And the single reason that my consumption ramped up so dramatically was that I got a new job, and it involves me, I still have it, it involves me driving around and spending a lot of time in my car. So my audiobook consumption went way, 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 way up, and it kicked my Stephen King journey into overdrive. And grab a few more books, I'll be right back. So 2019, man, that's the year when everything just takes off. So I mentioned that from 1995 to 2018, I had done 36 books. 2019 was like 14 books in and of itself. Starting with Firestarter. I have mixed feelings about Firestarter. It feels very jarringly like two books in one, and I think it has a really, really weak and strange ending. Probably one of, what a wishy-washy thing to say, probably one of my least favorites of the classic era, and one that I would consider to be overrated. Moving on from Firestarter, continuing in my picking up stuff that I missed, Pet Sematary. I really, really respect the heck out of this book. It's dark, and it goes there, and I really enjoy it. This one I consider one of the best of the classic period. Following, Thinner, which I enjoyed. It's kind of greasy and kind of grungy, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it to be amusing and dark and twisted, and I got a real kick out of it. So here's one that I did not have high hopes for, because a lot of people rip it to shreds, and Stephen King himself claims that this book is not very good. Well, I thought that it was decent. It was way better than I was expecting. It kind of starts off a mess, and then it gets down to brass tacks and actually turns out to be a pretty enjoyable book. And all the cocaine energy notwithstanding, I liked this one a lot more than I thought I was going to. After the Tommyknockers, The Dark Half. Really, really interesting book. Kind of, if you tied it to Stephen King's real life, it would be about how he was outed as Richard Bachman and his pseudonym died. But in this book, the author's pseudonym comes back to life and starts killing people. So it requires a pretty massive suspension of disbelief, but if you can get past that and just go along with it, go along for the ride, it's pretty entertaining. Okay, moving right along. Needful Things. This was one that I definitely consider to be overwritten, but I listened to the audiobook, like a lot of these books in the last few years, and Stephen King narrates it, and he is hilarious narrating the audiobook of Needful Things, and I thoroughly enjoyed the performance. If you've not checked it out, I recommend it. When I was a kid, I used to find Stephen King's voice to be super annoying, but as I've gotten older, I like it more and more, and nobody knows these characters better than he does, and he really breathes life into them in an amusing way. So after Needful Things, one of Stephen King's all-time masterpieces. I was very familiar with the stories in this book. Why did I never read this book? Why had I never picked it up until 2019? I don't know, but I'm glad that I did, and yep, it's a masterpiece. One of Stephen King's all-time best. After Different Seasons, another novella collection, which ranks among Stephen King's worst. This was him picking up the pieces of his life and his talent after his big come-to-Jesus moment with his family, where he got clean and he tried to beat his demons, and he was having a hard time writing. He was having a hard time finding his muse. He was plagued by doubt that maybe it was never him, that was not his talent, it was the drugs and the alcohol. The result is more therapy than enjoyable book. There's a couple of good things in here. The Regulators I thought was fine. The Library Policeman is probably my favorite piece from this. Secret Window, since I read this so soon after The Dark Half, I found Secret Window to just be like a shorter version of that same story, and I found it very annoying. And The Sundog, oh my god, that could have been a 12-page short story. Instead it's like a 150-page novella. Not a fan. So after 4 Past Midnight, I moved on to another collection, complete change of pace, Hearts in Atlantis, which I thoroughly enjoyed. The shorter pieces at the end, they were fine. The more avant-garde, non-narrative, it's all good and fine, but the low men in yellow coats, please tell me that that's what it's called. Yeah, Low Men in Yellow Coats, thoroughly enjoyed. Hearts in Atlantis, the novella, the autobiographical novella, was amazing and very moving. As a fan of Stephen King, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Then I moved on to Blockade Billy, which is a single story in one book. It's an interesting enough story. It's always curious to me how some stories don't ever get published in books. They're just in magazines or whatever. They're never collected. And then other stories end up in their own standalone mini books. Nothing wrong with Blockade Billy. It's a great story, but... And then Dr. Sleep. I was nervous because The Shining is my favorite Stephen King novel, and I was nervous for a sequel to my favorite, but Dr. Sleep is really, really cool, and it was surprisingly emotional. There's even like an emotional arc and a lot of closure that comes with some characters, and there was a lot that was very unexpected to this. Rose the Hat and the True Knot are terrifying monsters, but perfect villains for this book. I'm a big fan of Dr. Sleep. My biggest surprise, so the book that I knew the least about that surprised me the most in 2019 was the second book in the Bill Hodges trilogy, Finders Keepers. Now this completely came out of left field, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had actually been thinking a lot about J.D. Salinger and reading up on him, rereading some of his works, and this book made me think a lot of J.D. Salinger, and also book collecting, like the collectors that are like at an insane level. This book made me think of that too. I don't consider myself, like most crazy people, I don't consider myself crazy, so I didn't take offense to this book, but I really, really liked it, and I wasn't expecting much. And then after Finders Keepers, another single short piece in its own standalone book. It is called a novel on the cover, but word count wise, page count wise, in this teeny little book, it comes out at maybe 150 pages. It could be a novella. I would buy that. And I enjoyed it. It didn't make a big impression on me, but I thought that it was fine. Not a major Stephen King work, but also not an embarrassment. And then I finished 2019 with The Outsider. Now, a lot of people do not like the character of Holly Gibney. I'm a fan. I like Holly. The Outsider is a big showcase for Holly, and it gets a little crazy, but it has some really interesting pieces, and just one of the classic brilliant Stephen King set pieces, when the man, whose name I forget, is going to court at the beginning, the courthouse, and the tension that ratchets up over dozens of pages. Stephen King, when he's firing on all cylinders and doing stuff like that, he is unparalleled. But that's 2019. Those are all the books that I did in 2019. I'm going to go pull another stack of books, and we'll move on to 2020. Okay, we've made it to 2020, the year the world ended. And I pulled up on my pace of listening to Stephen King books in 2020, and I did a whole bunch of other stuff. But anyway, I still made it through quite a few, starting with the original cut of The Stand. And I consider this to be a separate book because in a lot of ways it is. The complete and uncut version is dozens and dozens and dozens of pages longer. So I call this its own thing. And my big takeaway after reading this version was I like the uncut version better. Following, I dove straight to the bottom of the Richard Bachman pile with Roadwork. This is one of my very least favorite books under any name, but particularly anything that involves Stephen King. It's just kind of a drag and a slog, and I didn't enjoy it. But I did very much enjoy Dolores Claiborne. It's another technical challenge, so it comes back to back with Gerald's Game, a book about one person in one place, and then Dolores Claiborne is an entire novel written as a monologue from one woman, and I really liked it. It has a few missteps, but overall I consider it to be an underrated Stephen King classic. Then a contemporary collection, If It Bleeds, another really solid short story collection from Stephen King. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Then I tackled a couple of big boys. Under the Dome, which has some just miserable SOB characters in it, but this really is a fascinating microcosm and sort of a satire on American society, and it's big, it's a lot, but I understand that Stephen King originally had the idea for the book when he was much younger, and he realized that it was too big for him, so he put it aside, and he came back to it decades later, and I just get goosebumps when I think about Stephen King coming back, like Stephen King being ready to tackle something that was too big for him, you know, back when he was young and writing such minuscule pieces such as The Stand. That was not too big for him, but Under the Dome was. Anyway, it's a real piece of work. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't like a lot of the characters very much, but I enjoyed the overall world that Stephen King created. And the technical accomplishment of the novel itself. Speaking of technical accomplishment, 11/22/63. Oh man. Of all the modern era Stephen King books, I would say 2000 or later, 11/22/63 is the only one to crack my top 10. It is a masterpiece, and it's another one that Stephen King had to wait decades until he was ready because it was too big when he was young, and it made me see history in a new way. It was engaging, it was gripping, it was a fascinating what if. It requires a little suspension of disbelief, but that's okay. It was thoroughly enjoyable and thought-provoking, and has a nice little bit of fan service when it goes back. The novel goes to Derry, and we revisit some of the characters from it, which I thought was a really nice touch. After 11/22/63, I finished out the Bill Hodges trilogy with End of Watch, and one thing I can say about this is that I remember very little about it. It wasn't that long ago that I listened to it, but it didn't make a very big impression on me, and I don't remember much about it, so I wouldn't consider it to be classic King. But one that I would make the argument for is The Institute. I find this to be a very underrated Stephen King novel. It has shades of Firestarter. It has shades of It. Any book with kids, it reminded me a bit of the kids from The Body, the novella from different seasons, oddly. But it was really engaging and very enjoyable, and just seemed to kind of slide under the radar. There was no signed limited edition, not a lot of fanfare with this one. It just came out, and then life moved on, and then the next year the next one came out, and this one kind of got just swept under the rug, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And my final 2020. So I didn't read Nightmares and Dreamscapes from start to finish in 2020. I had already read many of the pieces inside the collection, but what I did at the end of 2020 was I read all the rest, all the ones that I hadn't done. So I finished Nightmares and Dreamscapes in 2020. It is an epic, mammoth collection with a lot of really cool stuff. It's hard to go wrong with a Stephen King story collection. There's something for everybody, and Nightmares and Dreamscapes certainly has some really strong stuff. So that's 2020. 2021, I started the year with a bit of a Bachman binge. I finished out the Bachman books that I lacked, that I hadn't read or listened to, starting with Rage. I actually found an audiobook version of Rage, and it's perfect. It's from sometime seemingly back in the 80s, and it's really lo-fi. and the voice of the narrator, he sounds like a teacher or more like a principal of a school. And it was not as easy to listen to because the fidelity wasn't quite so crisp and clear, but I think it actually was perfect for the book. The book itself, as controversial as it is, I'm not not such a fan of it. It doesn't. I don't think it deserves all the hype and the controversy that it has gotten. And it was all right. It was one of Stephen King's earliest pieces, and anyway, so I followed up Rage with one of Stephen King's very best, under any name, The Long Walk. This is by far the best and my favorite of the Bachman books. It's also one of the earliest things that Stephen King wrote. He did revise it a bit before it was published in the late 70s to update some of the cultural references. I don't know exactly how much of this is from his original version that he wrote when he was in college, but it is one of his earliest ideas, one of his earliest pieces, and it is just brilliant. It reminded me a lot of things like The Hunger Games that came later, that dystopian YA fiction with an edge. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I also thoroughly enjoyed The Running Man, and pardon me for this terrible paperback with Arnold Schwarzenegger on the cover, but The Running Man is bonkers, gonzo, balls to the wall action, and very dark, very nihilistic, but it just clips along. This is the one that Stephen King supposedly wrote over just a few days in the early 1970s before Carrie was published, and it's like a runaway train, like a freight train or a truck with no brakes barreling down a hill. It's a good time. I enjoyed it. And then I went back and picked up one that I had been dreading for years. I'm not a huge fantasy fan, and I don't know what about this famous cover would have led me to believe that the book features a lot of dragon stuff. I don't know. What would it be about this cover that would make one think it's all about dragons? It's really hardly about dragons at all, which I thought was very funny when I read it. I was like, that dragon hardly features. But anyway, sorry, spoiler alert, but I wish that I had read this when I was a teenager. Once I finally did read it, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's different. It stands alone. It's sort of like the younger cousin or stepbrother, the baby brother of the Dark Tower series in a way, and I liked it. I liked it a lot. Then another one in the why the hell haven't I already read this book file, Misery. It's another stylistic challenge, basically two people alone in a house, and this one was originally slated to be a Richard Bachman book, but it was changed after Bachman was outed and died of cancer of the pseudonym. But knowing that it started life as a Bachman idea gives you a sense of sort of the darkness of the tone, which is a little bit darker than your typical Stephen King, but just a really tight, sort of short, classic book. I really liked it. I am really sorry to say that I did not very much care for Duma Key. That was the next book that I listened to in 2021. I have a friend named Diana who loves this book to pieces, and I wanted to like it because she likes it so much, but I just couldn't get into it. I did the audiobook, and maybe I was just in the wrong headspace, but it just kind of felt like going through the motions to me, and I just kind of had this negative outlook about it. And someday I'll go back and try it again, and hopefully it'll resonate with me in a different way. Maybe when I'm closer in age to the characters in the book, I'll go back and try it again and see if it speaks to me differently. Then a contemporary novel to 2021 later, which is another hard case crime original, and another one. So The Colorado Kid I thought was the pits. Joyland I really enjoyed. Later I really enjoyed. It's another sort of modest thriller, with supernatural overtones and some horror elements and some crime elements. I really liked this one. It's modest, it's not classic Stephen King, but it is solid B level, like second tier Stephen King. Then I finished out 2021 with the new book, the other new book of 2021, Billy Summers. This one was okay. I would give it maybe a C plus on an A to F scale. It had some amazing set pieces. The hit from the office tower, the escape, like all of that was cool. There's some cool fan service that ties back to The Shining, which I really appreciated. But it kind of fizzles out for me toward the end. But overall, it was fine. I liked it. I mean, I can't say like, oh, that was a terrible book, I just hated it. It was fine, but it's just not a classic in my opinion. Okay, 2022, again from the I can't believe I haven't read this before now file, The Talisman. So I expected to like The Talisman. I really, really wanted to like The Talisman, and I didn't. I didn't like The Talisman. It kind of drove me crazy. And there's a few reasons why, and I talk more about those in the video about The Talisman, but it wasn't my favorite. From the list, the short list of Stephen King books I expected to love that I actually really, really did not, The Talisman is high on that list. Nothing comes higher on that list than this next book, Rose Matter, which I absolutely hate and loathe, and I have gone into the reasons why in greater detail in another video, but Rose Matter. Went on from Rose Matter to The Regulators. This was actually the last Richard Bachman book that I had to read, to listen to, and I really liked it. I thought that it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed the sort of demonic toys come to life and killing everybody, the social commentary, the commentary on our TV obsessed culture. I liked the connections to Desperation. It made me remember Desperation, which I hadn't read in years. Makes me want to go back and read it some more, or read Desperation again, so I can compare the two. But I didn't expect to like it. I liked it a lot. One that I really, really didn't expect to like, but liked a lot, was Dreamcatcher. So Stephen King has talked a lot about being inspired by EC Comics and the horror comics of the 50s. And there was a lot about Dreamcatcher that made me think of those classic horror comics. And I really appreciated that. Stephen King wrote this after his accident. And I guess he wrote it longhand on a pad of paper while he was just in the depths of his pain pill fog. And I wasn't expecting much. I was pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed Dreamcatcher. So, Black House, the sequel to Talisman, I was not looking forward to, because I did not care for Talisman, as I mentioned, but Black House is a freaking masterpiece. It more than lives up to the hype of its two amazing authors collaborating. The Talisman, I felt like I could always see the seams where like one author would write something, pass it over to the other, and I could see where those connective pieces were. Black House is seamless, and it's dark, and it's scary, and it's interesting, and it ties into the Dark Tower, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it so much it makes me retroactively enjoy Talisman more. After Black House, I went and picked up The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is the 4.5 book in the Dark Tower series. I wasn't expecting much, but again, I was pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed this one. It was modest, not classic, iconic King, but it was still a good time. And, okay, so after The Wind Through the Keyhole, I finished up the Gwendy trilogy. I had read the second book of the Gwendy trilogy, which was not written by Stephen King, just by Richard Chismar. And then I did Gwendy's Final Task. The best thing I can say about it is that it has some interesting fan service, some connections to Derry, but that's all I will say. It has some interesting fan service, but anyway, after Gwendy's final task, I saw out 2022 with the new book of 2022, Fairy Tale. This book I liked pretty well. It splits right down the middle between the now here story and the there story, and I thought that was fine. It was a little bit jarring. You spend hundreds of pages in one place, and then it just like a knife drops in the middle, then the next hundreds of pages are in another place. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was worth revisiting. I wouldn't mind if Stephen King revisited the world of Fairy Tale. I liked how it had connections to the Wizard of Oz. I wouldn't mind learning more about that place. Fairy Tale was an interesting change of pace. It's not a classic in my opinion. Time will tell if it grows in stature. But a big part of the last few years, I was kind of haphazardly piecemeal going through and picking up books and checking things off the list that I hadn't done before. And in a lot of ways, I was going with, I have these that I can choose from, and I want to pick the best one, the most interesting one. So I really wasn't looking forward to the last couple on my list, but 2023, my final two Stephen King. I started the year with Lisey's Story, which had some really interesting ideas and some interesting content. I found it to be long-winded. I found it to be self-consciously literary. I think this is the book that Stephen King wrote after getting the National Letters Award, and I found it to be just a little pretentious, honestly, but it does come together, and it's satisfying in the end, and it has its scary moments, but overall, I felt like it was trying too hard. Which brings me to probably nobody's favorite Stephen King book, but the last one on my list. Luckily, it's another one that I had very low expectations for, but actually surprised me in a number of ways, and that was Cell. So obviously, just right out of the gate, it's dated. It's really dated, but there's a lot of great works of literature, movies that are of their time, and they seem hopelessly dated by today's standards. But part of the joy is getting sucked into sort of a time machine, and you go back to a moment in time. In this case, a moment that I thoroughly remember living through. But anyway, it was another. It was very Bachman-esque to me, and had a lot to say about society, some of which was very out of date and some of which was still pretty current. And I was pleasantly surprised, and I thought that it was a fine way to end my journey. But man, 77 books, and I can't help. I talk. But I am really excited about having finished this journey. I can't wait to start picking up some of the things that I haven't read since I was a teenager and experiencing them again. But I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on this journey with me, and I will talk to you later. Bye.